Knowledge in the 20th century has in many ways been concerned with issues which are common to the entire modern philosophical epoch. Issues like certainty, issues like the epistemological status of the tripartite division of culture that Kant left us: science, morality and politics, and aesthetic judgment. What distinguishes 20th century epistemology from previous epochs has been the search for a certain foundation for knowledge of the external world and what I will call the linguistic turn and the problem of representation that it gives rise to. These are two separate issues. One, the quest for foundations, the other, the problem of representation. Let's look first at the question of foundations. In the 20th century, philosophy has been responding to the ways in which Hegel and Nietzsche, most notably, through respectively historicism and perspectivalism, demonstrated the contingency of many of our beliefs. Hegel showed us that much of what we believe is not a result of nature forcing those beliefs on us, but are the result of various contingencies that have emerged over the past. Nietzsche showed us that many of our views are perspectival. They're a question of the attitude we take, of the posture which we use in looking at a particular problem. Both then are focusing on the problem of contingency and belief, that our beliefs are not necessitated and determined by anything that is absolute. And insofar as they stress this feature, they give rise to what is now the modern problem of relativism, right? Where truth is, at least in its most crude form, whatever a particular agent or culture chooses or is socialized to believe. Our moral beliefs are not so much a function of the moral nature of the universe, perhaps, so much as the particular moral doctrines which our parents inherited from ancestors and have passed on to us. So part of the project of epistemology in the 20th century has been to establish a foundation, what's often called a ground, for our knowledge that is itself absolutely certain and fixed. It gives us a sort of bedrock upon which we can hopefully distinguish those parts of our other culture, our cultural precincts, which are truth-bearing. And that's an important distinction. We want to be able to mark out what's capable of being true or not, and what is properly relativistic, a matter of judgment, a matter of what the taste or choices of a particular agent. The other part of the 20th century project, the linguistic turn and its question of representation, has to do with the way in which language was reconsidered as the form of culture and thought. Now, I want to suggest in some ways this is not a complete departure. Remember that ever since Descartes, modern philosophy has believed that our experience of the world is mediated, right? That mediation is by a medium of representation, and for Descartes that was the mind and its ideas. So all we know about the world, we know through our minds and the ideas we have of the world. And the question was always, how do we know whether these ideas do in fact accurately represent or copy the external world? Are our ideas adequate? Are they true? Are they a copy or do they correspond to reality? What happened in the modern epoch, in the 20th century, has been that instead of thinking of the mind as that representational medium, we've now realized that it's in fact language which stands between us and the world. So instead of saying whatever can be known must be an idea in a mind, we now say whatever can be an object of knowledge must be a sentence. We know the world always under some particular description. And of course, this raises, in addition to the traditional epistemological problems, new ones. How do we know that since descriptions are always relative to descriptive schemes, how do we know that our descriptive schemes reflect the nature of the universe? And their relativity can be easily established. Eskimos have about 40 different words for snow, depending on the color, on the texture, on the conditions in which it's found. Certain tropical peoples parse plants in ways that we don't. They have words for plants with large leaves and small leaves and multicolored leaves. And these are different distinctions they draw, very different from the ones we draw. So how do we know which of these schemes in fact represent the way the world really is in and of itself, parsed? In all our cases, what we come to is that our understanding of the world is encoded. And it's encoded and interpreted through our language. And it's only those sentences of that language and other linguistic entities that are bearers of truth values. And of course, such truth consists in the accuracy with which a particular sentence or set of sentences, perhaps a theory, represents some particular fact or state of affairs in the world. Now, as I've tried to suggest ways in which this linguistic turn is similar to the old problem of minds and ideas, but there is a difference. While this linguistic turn does allow us to still generate the old traditional skeptical questions, namely, how do we know that the conceptual categories arising from our language and our linguistic parsing of the world, or in old-fashioned terms, our ideas, correspond to the actual features of things as they really are in and of themselves, there is an advantage to the linguistic turn, and that's this, which is the mind is by nature, we know from Descartes, an unextended substance. It's something which is incorporeal, can never be directly observed. And ideas, similarly, are non-spatio-temporal. They cannot be observed. They can only be experienced through some sort of introspection. Language, on the other hand, is a physical and social phenomenon. Right? It's a natural thing. Language is markings on paper, like I have in front of me. It's sounds emitted from my larynx that you hear in your ears. So it's something very physical and observable. Because of this, it can be subjected to a far greater scrutiny than our non-extended minds and supersensible ideas. So you've got two complexes making up modern epistemology that I'm going to pursue here today. And that is, on the one hand, the question of certainty, of foundation, and on the other, representation. And I want to argue that in thinking of representation, we can see or categorize four basic strategies that have been tried in the 20th century epistemology. And I'll go through them in some detail, but very quickly, one attempt has been to get behind representation, to avoid the problem of representation through using some particular sort of method that will solve that problem. Another approach has been to clarify representation, to analyze the nature of representation itself. A third approach has been to note the failure of representation, where representation doesn't seem to work, where language doesn't seem to represent adequately. And then finally, the last approach I'm going to mention is an outright rejection of representation entirely. Okay, what do I mean by getting behind representation? Well, think of it this way, if language is a medium that stands between us and the world, if we could somehow short-circuit that route, avoid the false differences that language imposes on us, we could get in touch with reality at least somewhat more directly. Right? So one approach to the problem of epistemology has been to frankly acknowledge that the conceptual scheme imposed by our language doesn't always accurately represent the features of the world. Right? We take it as a given that there are such misrepresentations. Then, given that, certain thinkers have attempted to marshal various sorts of procedures and methods and techniques to eliminate those linguistically imposed distortions that get in the way of our getting in touch with the truth, that occlude our apprehension of the truth. And these methods and procedures, and the results of their philosophic use, generate precisely the sort of necessary and certain foundations from which the philosopher can criticize the rest of the culture and its distortions. So getting behind representation will allow us to have, if the method is adequate, the method will generate a epistemological foundation from which we can assess the rest of the culture. Now, one exemplary example of this attempt to get behind representation is Husserlian phenomenology. What's the method? The method in this case is phenomenological, and then subsequent to that, eidetic reduction. And the purpose of this method, what Husserl is really trying to do, is remove the historically contingent elements of our linguistic consciousness, of our conceptual scheme. Right? Part of our conceptual scheme is just a result of the way we talk, whether it's true or not. Phenomenological and eidetic reduction gets past that. So these sort of reductive techniques claim to be attempts to circumvent what's in post-structural terms called the differences of language, right? Language parses things by differentiating, very often in a false way. So phenomenological and eidetic reduction then will allow us to circumvent these differences and experience or reflect upon the pure forms of subjectivity and consciousness, the forms that are pure because no longer polluted by the distortion of our language. Now, what's particularly important in this regard is that second reduction that Professor Sugrue talked about, the eidetic reduction, because it discloses just the sort of necessary and universal, because essential, and that's the whole point of the word eidetic. It comes from the Greek eidos, the essence. It gives you exactly the sort of essential, necessary, and universal epistemological foundations or standpoint from which to assess and critique the rest of the culture. So, for example, Husserl's phenomenology, which gets us in touch with pure forms of experience and consciousness, allows us to see the sterility of positivism, of naturalism, of empiricism, and of all the other positions that can't see past language and past its occluding distortions to the necessary and universal forms of subjectivity and possibility that Husserl's tried to capture. Now, I mention Husserl as exemplary because other phenomenologists will vary in some way. I think Bergson also is interested in getting in touch with what is in some way primary and pre-linguistic, a pure experience, but does in very different ways. Heidegger, his phenomenological project and moves are also different from Husserl's. He rejects the eidetic reduction and what he calls the whole mathematicized project behind Husserl and Western metaphysics. But he also shares with Husserl the belief that our linguistic scheme of beings, of things, is hopelessly, as he puts it, ontic, as opposed to ontological, and obscures capital B, being. In other words, our talk of things, of beings, of physical objects, parsed by language, obscures what is the real metaphysical reality, the real thing we have to get in touch with, which is the property of existence itself, being qua being. So how do you avoid this distorting mechanism? Because our language talks about beings rather than being. Well, in his case, the method is a sort of, I would call it quasi-Kierkegaardian meditation on concern, dread, death, temporality, and conscience. That's his methodology, a sort of existential rumination. If that happens, at least Heidegger believes, we will be able to see the world as it really is, as opposed to the way it seems under our false positivistic descriptions. Or as Heidegger might have put it, only under such circumstances of this sort of existential meditation will capital B, being, disclose itself to us. Otherwise, we are limited by seeing merely beings with a little b. All right, so that's one approach to getting behind representation, is phenomenological reduction. And we've seen various varieties in the course of this series. Another approach, I think, is best exemplified by the work of Jürgen Habermas and his predecessors in the Frankfurt School. They too thought that language and speech distorted reality, particularly social reality. And this was because our speech was distorted by hidden irrational interests of particular groups, specifically elite classes. And they had a method for, again, getting behind this distorted representation, and that method was ideology critique. An ideology critique grounded in, on the one hand, a Marxian scientific understanding of society, on the other, a dialectical method, and finally, in the case of Habermas, enriched by emancipatory speech. Okay. Now, this ideology critique, as it's presented to us by the Frankfurt School and Habermas, even when it's immanent, and by immanent, which is the case with Habermas, it means that we're criticizing bourgeois culture from its own internal values. Even as such, it reveals the systematic distortion in our speech, particularly in our talk about our polity and society. It shows us how mass media, how the interests of elites configure language in such a way as to get us to redescribe the world in ways that are in their interests, as opposed to accurately representing the world as it really is. Insofar then as Habermasian and Frankfurt School ideology critique allows us to see these systematic distortions, presumably they allow us to recover a more accurate representation of the facts, particularly the facts of the social situation. And we can all think of examples. Ideology critique allows us to overcome the fetishism of commodities, right? It allows us to see that when we say pork bellies are doing well, we're reifying pork bellies. What we're really talking about is that people are making a lot of money speculating on something that people are going to have to eat eventually. Similarly, ideology critique allows us to recover the fact of our alienation from our species being, something which never shows up in our mass consumerist ideology. Now, because this critique is grounded in a discourse, right, which is both dialectical, right, Hegelian, and at the same time scientific, Marxian historical materialism, it's assumed that this discourse, this ideology critique of the Habermasian and Frankfurt School, will serve as a certain and firm foundation, as a legitimate ground for the philosophic results that arise from applying this technique of Marxist ideology critique. So whereas phenomenology gave us a certain and firm foundation from which to criticize the rest of the culture, so does Marxist ideology critique based on social science, dialectical reasoning, and perhaps emancipatory speech. And again, it does in fact produce particular critical results. Results for Habermas and the Frankfurt School is that sometimes science, and in particular non-Marxist social science, is really just bourgeois ideology. It's not really scientific at all. Another result, prosperity isn't really all it's cracked up to be. The pursuit of consumerist pleasure is turning us all into one-dimensional morons. That's the sort of results we get from the Frankfurt School, things which would never occur to us until we have the distortions in our culture and language removed. So that's one approach, to get behind representation. Another approach is to clarify representation. What this means is that the thinker will examine language as a medium of representation and try to understand its mechanisms rather than supersede it or get around it. It'll instead try to work right through it. What this, in fact, will generally mean is a very careful analysis of language and representation, which tries to underlie its fundamental and necessary elements. By showing how language works, i.e. how it represents the world, such analysis allows us to demarcate, to separate the parts of language that are truth-bearing from those parts that are not. This sort of an analysis is always in itself said to be certain and necessary, and it serves as a foundation, a groundwork for our less certain, in most cases generally scientific, propositions. Again, probably the best exemplar of this tradition is the sort of logical positivism we looked at with A.J. Ayer. Right? Ayer offered an analysis of language which divided all sentences into, all truth-bearing sentences at least, into two classes, the analytic and the synthetic. Right? If you remember, analytic sentences were always absolutely certain and necessary because they were based on the logical structure of language itself. Right? And that refers to artificial as well as natural languages. And they were, in fact, ultimately held to be tautological and for that reason necessary. What does this ultimately mean? It means that these analyses of language, this clarification of representation, gives us truth about the nature of all representations, what it is to be a representation. And therefore, such truths are necessary, but at the same time, they only tell us about representation and not about the world itself. It only tells us about our linguistic representations of the world. Now, again, looking at logical positivism itself claimed to be just such an analytic body of knowledge, right? It was necessary, certain, because it was only about the nature of language as opposed to the world. Sentences about the world were said to be synthetic. And these, of course, are based upon an accurate representation of the world, right? Truth is when your synthetic propositions copy the states of affairs which they're presumably reporting. And when they are true, positivists believe they could be reduced to sentences about the actual experience of the world. So some sentences about this lectern in front of me could, if true, be reduced to sentences about my own sense experience of that lectern. Now, while such sentences, synthetic sentences about the lectern, could never have the certainty of analytic sentences, tautological statements about the structure of language, a careful attendance and awareness of the needs for intersubjective observation and experience could generate the sort of practical certainty that we associate with the modern nomological physical sciences, the natural sciences. So again, we start with a certain foundation, a foundation of analytic knowledge about the nature of representation, and from that certain foundation we can distinguish when we have grounds for practical certainty in science. But even there, it has to be remembered, such knowledge will always be practical and can, in fact, be subject to revision later. Scientific theories do change over time. Overall, positivist epistemology produced a three-part division of culture, or at least of sentences. Those which are certain, and these are the analytic sentences. Those which are merely probable, and these are the synthetic sentences. And those which bear no truth values at all, may express emotion or opinion or taste, and therefore are neither true or false. And again, the examples there would be aesthetics, right? We don't dispute about taste. For the positivists, morality. Morality was fundamentally a projection of your feelings. It wasn't something which moral statements were neither true nor false. Religious expressions, neither true nor false for the most part. They're statements about one's feelings or one's opinions. There was another sort of attempt to clarify representation, and that was in the structuralism, linguistic structuralism found on the continent. Structuralism also offered an analysis of language which distinguished between the necessary and contingent. In this case, instead of being called analytic and synthetic, the distinction was the synchronic, that which was spatially organized and contemporaneous, and the diachronic, that which unfolded over time and was therefore contingent. Now, I don't want to suggest that structuralism is identical to positivism or a French version of it. It's not. There are differences. I mean, just think of Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss was offering a very deep structural reading of things, in that things were never as they quite appeared on the surface, very different from the temper of positivism. Nonetheless, these structures that Strauss analyzed were themselves logically necessary parts of the world, much like the analytic propositions of logical positivism. And structuralism itself claimed to be synchronic rather than diachronic, which means that it claimed itself to be in positivist terms, analytic and absolutely certain knowledge of language. And again, like the synthetic, the diachronic's truth was always seen, just like the synthetic truth, as a question of accuracy of representation. Our diachronic sentences are true when they copy or correspond to the structure of reality and nature of reality itself. Okay. Now, another strategy, a very radical strategy, has been to argue that representation fails in language. And that's really perhaps the most challenging feature of contemporary post-structuralism. It has literally claimed that the representational ability of language has been shown to be nil. Or language is a representational scheme that just doesn't work. Now, in the idiom of post-Saussurean linguistics, this means undermining the distinction between, well, the diachronic and the synchronic, between langue and parole. But what this practically means is a return to the historical, by which they usually use the term diachronic, contingency of Hegel and perspectivalism of Nietzsche, right back where the whole project started. What does this mean? Well, I mean, again, to put it in practical terms, what they're arguing is that, again, language is a system of differences, as they put it. It differentiates and parses parts of the world. But those parsings of the world are purely a function of the particular idiosyncrasies of a language game or of a particular culture. None of them are parts of the structure of the world itself. Okay. What they're saying then, and what's challenging about it is, well, two things. First, our language doesn't represent accurately. But secondly, and this is what makes it so radical, is they never deny that truth would reside in an accurate representation. Right? That's not questioned. Truth is always accurate representation. They simply say that language doesn't accurately represent. And that's what makes it a really radical position. We don't have any truth. So instead of finding an accuracy of representation, the result of, in the place of the certainty which was sought after in phenomenology and in positivism, we're left instead with the free play of signifiers, of words and semiotics simply bandying about, being reconfigured in various combinations without any particular significance. We're faced with the ironic reconfiguration and slippage of meaning. We have post-structuralists tell us that the text means nothing. The text is simply the confluence of various languages, of various language games. If you enter with a different language game, you get a different meaning from the text. And the author, well, the author is dead as well. The author has no significance in the interpretation of the text. It's just a series of signifiers, of symbols, markings on a page, whose representation is opaque, and therefore can be interpreted practically any way you want to interpret it. All interpretation turns out to be radically contingent. In fact, interpretation is always then a question of misreading. And the distinction then is, well, there are some obviously weak misreadings, and there are stronger misreadings, more intuitive misreadings, and those are the ones, of course, we consider important, and we give the people who come up with those PhDs. So to sum up this tradition, what we get epistemologically, what's often called the postmodern condition. The postmodern condition is that of a speaker caught in a failed representational scheme. Right? We speak in a language which by nature is representational but fails to represent. Where even this knowledge that the representational scheme is itself fails is subject to criticism once it's encoded in language. From this point of view, any claims to truth and knowledge turn out ultimately to be veiled claims to authority or power. Now, I want to argue that there's one last and even, in some ways, more radical position epistemologically, and that's to reject representation outright. And that's the position that the pragmatists have taken. The pragmatists actually go one step further than the post-structuralists. Why? The post-structuralists say language is a representational scheme. It just doesn't work. The pragmatists say language isn't a representational scheme at all. It has nothing to do with representation. Right? Following people like Wittgenstein, they argue that language is just a tool. It's a game we play. That the relationship between language and the world is not one of copying. It's not one of representation at all. The relationship is causal. Language encodes, in a stimulus and response way, various bits of behavior, various sorts of habits and activities, and we speak to prompt those sorts of activities on the parts of others, to manipulate our environment. So language is like any other piece of technology or tool. Like the post-structuralists, this does result, this view of language as non-representational, it's anti-representational. It does result in the breakdown of those distinctions that the phenomenologists and positivists tried to create early in the century. Distinctions between, well, necessary and contingent, analytic and synthetic. We saw this with Quine, right? Quine destroyed that distinction between the analytic and the synthetic, and with it, the necessary and contingent. Everything turns out ultimately, from this perspective, to be contingent. Nothing is certain. Everything is subject to revision. And we saw this with Quine as well. Once you destroy the analytic-synthetic distinction, logic is no longer analytic. And Quine came to the position where he said, well, look, if our logic ultimately does start to produce scientific quandaries, we'll scrap our logic. Nothing is sacrosanct. And that's the result of Quine's holism. So what this means is, since certainty is gone as a possibility, it means two things. First, the best that we can ever hope for is practical certainty, what we get in science. Right? That's the highest epistemological ground, or the firmest ground we can ever hold. It also means, however, since we have no grounds for real certainty, that there is no higher ground to critique the rest of the culture. Remember, the positivists were in a position to be able to say, what they do in the physical sciences and those departments over there, that generates real knowledge. What they do in the social sciences, that gets close to generating real knowledge, or part of it does. What they do in the humanities is a very different story. And what they do in the fine arts department has nothing to do with knowledge at all. That's because they had an epistemologically certain ground from which to critique. The pragmatists deny us that. And as a result, there is no way to distinguish which is more true, Van Gogh paintings or the theory of relativity. becomes a pointless question. But the difference between this and the post-structuralist position, whereas the post-structuralists had denied us truth because they said truth is accuracy of representation and we just don't have it. The pragmatists say, yeah, we don't have accuracy of representation, but that's not truth anyway. So they don't offer us a new theory of truth. Rather what they do, and Rorty has really summed this up wonderfully in a phrase, is they try to change the subject anytime you bring it up. You ask them, well, what's the nature of truth? And they say, well, who really knows? I got a much more interesting topic for you. Let's talk about the sociology of science. Now that's interesting. Or how do sociologists come to agree on a description of a scientific procedure? That's more interesting. Or better than talking about truth, well, instead of telling you when is a sentence true, when is it justifiable to assert a sentence? And that's actually the most obvious candidate for replacing truth, and many pragmatists have followed this route, is to talk about warranted assertability instead. We don't know what the truth is. We don't have a theory of truth. But we can tell you what procedures make one sentence more warranted than another. Right? What sort of observations, what sort of experiences, what sort of intersubjective tests. Part of pragmatism also is a tendency to, as I've tried to suggest, sociologize epistemology. To say, and the best example of this is Thomas Kuhn. Right? To say, look, you want to know what scientific truth is? Let's go watch some scientists. See how they do it. And whatever procedures they come up with, that's probably it. And if they come up with different procedures next year, well, then the scientific truth has changed a little bit, hasn't it? Right? And that's a sort of naturalizing of it. Then there's an even more radical naturalizing of epistemology associated with Quine himself. The Quinean project of epistemology, pragmatic project, is something like this. He says, look, let's ask this as a question in biology and behavioral science. How do featherless bipeds, Homo sapiens sapiens, make noises, mark papers, and with those noises and papers build up modern science, including in it philosophy and a naturalized epistemology? And the explanation shouldn't be logical, it shouldn't be representational, it should be purely causal. How do they use markings and sounds to control their world? And, for example, one way of seeing the difference, the logical positivists would ask us, what is the logical structure of language? How does it work? Quine asks, how do little babies learn to speak? What sort of optical experiences do they have before they say the word red, and under what circumstances? How does stimulus and response teach them to repeat the correct answers and turn away from the wrong ones? When do they learn the distinction between red as or apple as a general substance and an apple as an individuated object? How does that emerge? At what points? Okay. So we see four very different kinds of approaches to the problem of epistemology, and they have taken a certain historical trajectory. Phenomenology and positivism were early 20th century phenomena. Right? Early in the century, we had a hope to achieve in philosophy some sort of certainty, and a certainty from which we could solve the problem of relativism by critiquing the various parts of our culture. And both post-World War II movements, post-structuralism and pragmatism, have undermined that project and suggested you're just not going to get it, one more radically than the other. And what that's left us with is right back where we began with the problem of relativism. All of these 20th century traditions put together generate a sense of both cultural and moral relativism. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't because they're all relativistic. Right? They're not. The positivists aren't relativistic. They don't believe you can think whatever you want. The phenomenologists aren't, nor for that matter are necessarily pragmatists. But rather, what makes the accumulation of these views contribute to relativism is that their description of the epistemological situation, right, of the theory of knowledge, never generates a univocal moral and cultural position. Again, we'll take examples. Husserl's phenomenology, in the case of Husserl, generated what was probably a fairly humane moral position. Sartre's existential phenomenology generated, if it did generate it at all, a socialist outlook. Heidegger was a national socialist. Right? We can again look at pragmatism. James was a rugged individualist, a bit of an anarchist. Dewey veered towards socialism. Rorty is a post-bourgeois liberal. And it's claim that if you can get any political philosophy out of Quine, and I don't know that you can, it would probably be fairly conservative. Okay, so where does this leave us? I don't want to leave you with the sense of an unhappy ending to the story. We've gone through the history of philosophy up through the 20th century, and where are we left with? Relativism, and that's a real downer. I want to argue, in fact, in concluding, that there are a lot of different ways, really three that I'm going to look at, three different ways of reading this situation of relativism. One way you can read it is probably the most common way. It's a really bad sign. Relativism is a bad sign. And this is the view you find very often certain people on the political right engaged in what they call culture war. This is the culture war they're fighting, the problem of relativism. Because relativism is evidence of a crisis of confidence in the Western culture and civilization. Right? Relativism will ultimately lead to nihilism, to the belief that there are no rights and wrongs, no values, no morals, that there is no better and worse in art and in taste and in culture in general. Moreover, there seems to be this charge without epistemological foundations, without some certainty, without some philosophical ground, our cherished democratic and liberal traditions can never survive. Right? Democracy and liberal society, liberty, was based on a particular philosophical foundation, created in the Lockean moment, emerging out through criticism in the 19th century into a fully born 20th century traditions that we all live in, a whole form of life. Without its epistemological foundations, how do we know that democracy is any better than fascism? Besides that, it's simply our taste. And tastes change. Without foundations, those tastes will change. Now, that's perhaps the most gloomy view of things, and it's one which has a certain cogency and is often heard. It has an opposition, right? There are the people on the right in the cultural war, and there are people on the left, the people who embrace multiculturalism and things like that. And they read relativism as a very good sign. They say this is not going to undermine the Western democratic and liberal tradition. It's the culmination of the democratic and liberal tradition. Right. What does relativism mean to them? It means nothing more than contingency, that our views might be different than they are, that they're not necessitated, which is to say that our views are free. We have a choice. Right? So, what does relativism mean? It means that people can choose their own identities. They needn't think of themselves as part of the great Western project. If they choose to think of themselves under some other description, a relative description, perhaps as Euro-Americans or Asian Americans, that's their choice. That's their expression of their own sense of self, of identity. So relativism then means practically the freedom of individuals and groups to choose their own beliefs and values. Right? It's not the decline of the democratic tradition, but rather it's what James called, in thinking about pragmatism, he described pragmatism once as a sort of secular and universalized Protestant Reformation, which to the Catholic mind, as he put it, always looks like just anarchy. But to the Protestant mind, it means liberty, it means freedom, it means the individual's on his own ground to make his own choices. Well, so with relativism. Relativism means that each individual, each group, each entity has the freedom now to choose its own values, to choose its own path, to choose its own, and again, getting back to language, its own way, a scheme of describing itself and describing the situation it faces. And while to the cultural warriors on the right, this may look like nihilism and anarchy, to the cultural warriors on the left, this looks like freedom. This looks like liberty. This looks like self-determination. And I think, in fact, most of our debate about that awful R word, relativism, is between these two positions. Much of the discussion of moral decline ultimately comes out to be a debate between these two positions. Either our morality is based on absolutely eternal and certain verities, or there's nothing. And the other position is, if we have absolutely and eternal verities, you know, we're caught in dogmatism and the scholasticism of the past, and we never progress and advance. And that's pretty much the choice you're given publicly, because these are the people who argue. I want to argue there's a third position. The third position is always the one that's never argued publicly, because the third position in all polar debates is a pox on both your houses. Okay, what would that look like? You can read relativism as a good sign, you can read it as a bad sign, or, and here's the really challenging one, you can read it as an irrelevant sign. Okay, what does that mean? It means instead of saying there's a danger in relativism because it doesn't give us foundations for our democratic tradition, you raise the question whether it ever did in the first place. Right? Both sides have been pro and con in the relativism debate, are working on the basis of the assumption that our Western political practices are a function of our philosophic beliefs. So, for the people on the right, that means, well, if we don't have the certainty in those beliefs that we used to have, these traditions will go by the board. The group on the left will say just the opposite. When we erode the last negative elements of that tradition, we liberate ourselves from the racism, patriarchalism, and sexism and ethnocentrism of the past. The third position argues that, in fact, the Western democratic liberal tradition never really had much to do with philosophy in the first place. That it wasn't John Locke that gave us the liberal state, and that it wasn't Rousseau that gave us democracy. Who gave us the liberal state? Walpole, Disraeli, Martin Van Buren maybe in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, but maybe even more Melanchthon Smith. Right? Our values of freedom, of free speech, these aren't a result of the writings of Hume. They're a result of Peter Zenger more than anything. In other words, there is a petite tradition of everyday life, of practical politics, of practical politicians and reformers, of utopian schemers who weren't philosophers and didn't have any foundations. They just threw up schemes. And that is, in fact, what actually did generate our liberal democracy. Rorty describes this as democracy without foundations. And his point is that it never really did have those foundations, and if it did, even if it may have in the mind of someone like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, you can kick those foundations out. And in fact, there's a very interesting argument historically, because it says, even if we should find, for example, that the Founding Fathers, and I think you could find it, read Hume and Locke and Smith and a whole host of real Whig thinkers, the argument would be not that they got their ideas from Hume and Locke and Smith, but rather that they read and enjoyed Hume, Locke, and Smith because they said the sorts of things which people were practicing in America. They read other people who said totally different things, and they thought those people were horribly reactionary. Not because they were illogical and didn't have foundations, just because they didn't describe life as it was lived in 18th century Virginia or New York. So what that means is that these traditions which presumably need foundations are really the result of large-scale social and political movements led by practical political reformers, idealistic revolutionaries, utopians, etc. The real impact of the loss of philosophic foundations, then, and of certainty, has been, and this is where it becomes a very ironic view, has been that few outside of the high culture have even noticed. Right? That's the empirical basis for this third position. We've been missing philosophical foundations for democracy throughout much of the 20th century, certainly the second half of the 20th century. They don't seem to be rioting in the streets. They don't seem to be calling for the overthrow of the First Amendment. And the real reason is because outside of the cultural warriors on the left and the right, no one else has noticed, because that was never what democracy meant to them anyways. Most people didn't think of democracy in terms of Kant and Rousseau and Hume, or in terms of Hegel and Nietzsche. They thought of it in terms of John Kennedy, Woodrow Wilson, maybe Fiorello LaGuardia. Or they thought of it in terms of Simon Bolivar or George Washington, but not necessarily Locke, not necessarily Newton. So, in a certain sense then, perhaps what I'm trying to suggest is the decline of epistemology as a foundational discipline may not be so much of a loss as a growth of philosophy. It may be philosophy coming of age, at least from this third perspective, and saying, we once had a pretense about doing a particular job, which we never did, and which was never necessary. And in giving this up, we've given up a pretense which is well worth losing.